Okay, I think we're recording now. Like I was saying, even before the recording started, I so appreciate you being here today. I know that asynchronous courses are often with the idea that there is absolutely no requirement to be in one place at the one time. I offer this as an additional tool, so to speak. So the fact that you're here speaks volumes about your motivation and what kind of students you are. And trust me that I do also recognize that as an extra credit on your discussion forum. So at the end of the week, I normally go and add a little bit of extra credit for anyone who has joined me on these sessions. But these sessions, like I said, I do record them as well, and I make them available for anyone who wants to watch those recordings. But again, I offer, probably sometimes I debate, do I offer too many different tools for learning on my classes? So just identify the ones that work for you and capitalize on those. There is absolutely no expectation that you would have to use all of the tools, but just find the ones that work for you. So having said that, oh, I have again wrong. I did a different version. Let me just pause this one, and I'm gonna pull up the presentation from another source. I do them both at my own computer and then at work computer, and keeping on track of the versions is always the challenge. So let me pull up a different version. Summer. Now I think I have the right version. So let me just share this one. So now you should be seeing the right version of the presentation, especially as we get to the weekly topic. Like I said, I do use my old versions and update them, and sometimes I overlook something, but I think we're at the right edition now. So this week has been a busy week. We've been looking at muscular system, and we've been looking at muscular system in two ways. We've been looking first kind of general structure of a muscle with a focus on skeletal muscles. And then we've been looking at the big muscles of the body in kind of a larger scale, revising those. So that's a lot to cover. I'm going to be honest, in traditional 16 or 18 week semester, we would spend a couple of weeks on just learning the most important muscles. Obviously now in the summer, we're moving twice of the speed of the material. So I realized that it's a lot to take in. I realized that taking it in a short period of time can feel overwhelming. And for that reason, I am kind of flexible on if you do want to prepare notes and use those notes to guide you while you're completing assignments, that's totally fine. Moving onwards, I have the kind of same plan that I had last time that we met on Wednesday. I was going to talk a little bit about the weekly assignments. I was also going to kind of outline a couple of tips and tricks and themes that I've heard on the discussion forums. And let me just take a name of new attendees. So I'm sure to give them extra credit as well. And then I was going to spend majority of the time initially really briefly just giving you an expectation of what to expect with the exam 2 and practical 2, and then spent the majority of the time kind of reviewing the highlights, mainly focusing on chapter 11, but we'll also talk about chapter 10. Chapter 10 is literally going through those big muscles of the body one by one, and I do already have a couple of videos available where I do that on your Canvas course. So I normally don't on these live online sessions go through it once more because it kind of isn't super exciting. It is literally me pointing out a muscle and telling what it is. You probably will find, if that's useful for you, you will find that those videos already cover that content. But instead, for chapter 10, what I wanted to do was to give kind of general ideas and general pointers on how to memorize those muscles and how to cover that content. So that was my plan for today, but as always, these sessions can take any shape and they can kind of be adjusted based on whatever the class feels that would be useful. So please, 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 at any stage, feel free to just unmute yourself or drop to the chat comments, questions, things that come to your mind, and we'll totally focus on those. Because like I said, I've done this for a while. I can do it in many different ways, and whatever is helpful for you is where I want to spend the time on. So the very first thing, let me take again an attendee name. And I did see that there was a message on the chat, so let me just pull up the chat. I'm running on a little older computer, so it takes a little while for things to come up. Let's see what we've got. Of course, you can totally join from both from one device. I've marked it on my notes that I'll make sure that you both get extra credit for being here. If you don't mind, if you could do me a favor, just make sure that you drop onto the chat if there's something that I wouldn't be able to pick up the name, but I think I know exactly who you both are, and I'll make sure that you get those points. As always, I do say this to my face-to-face students as well. Just like students, I get busy as well, and just like students overlook things, and that's why I want to be super patient with my students. If anyone misses something, I might sometimes overlook things. So if you feel like you haven't gotten all of the points that you should have, or you have questions about the assignments that I've graded, it is very possible that I've made a mistake as well. So don't hesitate to ask that, hey, I would like to get a little bit of clarification. How did we end up here? So that's just being totally transparent. But where I wanted to start was to recognize the amazing job that you're doing in this class. We're way past the midpoint of the semester, and I follow the scores and I follow the grades very, very carefully. You'll see that I'm pretty active on the discussion forums as well, but even bigger part of my job is to stay on the tune of where we are doing. Typically, if you don't hear from me as an individual message, it means that you're doing well, and I don't have concerns. If someone starts to fall behind or their normal standard starts to slip, I do tend to reach out to everyone also individually in those cases as well. But I wanted to take this time and this opportunity to really acknowledge and recognize that I see the hard work you're putting in. I realize that doing the course twice at the speed of a normal semester is a lot. And I realize that many people have other commitments and other things that we would like to do during the summer. So the fact that you're doing this course and you're prioritizing the time on that speaks volumes of what amazing learners you are and how you're putting in the effort on where it really counts. So I just wanted to start with that. I feel sometimes we get so stuck into the routine of doing assignments, grading assignments, and getting those grades back, that recognition of all the work that goes into doing those assignments doesn't get mentioned enough. But I definitely do see it, and I do value it. And every time I read a great response, it is something that I take great time and great appreciation for. So hopefully that does also reflect on the feedback that I provide. I have been doing for a while with my students kind of a reflective things that we start classes, we start sessions by just kind of pausing before we jump into the material. And for that, recently I've been using an old Asian philosopher's book called Inward. Philosopher is called Pueblo, I believe. And the quote that I just randomly picked up for this week said that I gathered my habits and started releasing the ones that can never lead me to lasting freedom and joy. And I guess what I'm trying to say with that is that find those tools, find those ways of learning, those approaches that work for you, and focus on those. So again, you don't need to be doing everything on this class. You don't need to be using every resource, every piece of material, and you don't need to be even completing every single assignment. Obviously, there is a plan on the assignments that the homeworks that I've gathered kind of try to cover all the bases of what you need to learn, but you'll notice that I have a lot of extra credit assignments as well, including those want more questions. I'm super happy when I receive those, and I do receive quite a bit of those, and I always try to offer individual feedback on those as well, but you do not need to do those if you don't have time or if you don't have interest on those. I just try to offer different kinds of assignments so you can pick and choose. It's like a buffet. You choose what works for you, and we'll take it from there. So I guess that's what I wanted to say about that thought. Then I had this slide, and I think I mentioned even on Wednesday that when I initially put together this slide, I was a little hesitant that it's this really depressing view of what we're doing this week because it looks so busy. So this week we're covering 2 chapters, chapter 11 and chapter 10. And on both of those, I have certain assignments that you are very, very used to. I have a chapter quiz, I have chapter practice anatomy, and I have a chapter discussion. On those chapter discussions for chapter 11 and 10, I'm looking again 2 posts from every individual. If you want to have full marks, I'm looking first post, it could be more kind of your thoughts, and second post maybe being a little bit more responsive to something that someone else has shared. Again, the purpose is to create that sense of community and that kind of interaction. We have to be mindful as a college that we are not a correspondence school. We are offering online classes in addition to our other offerings, and those online classes do need to be interactive. So hence the discussions. I'm not going to say anything else than that I study in many, many schools, and in many schools I do write a lot of discussion posts as a student, and I do realize that sometimes it does feel repetitive, and sometimes it does feel a little bit of kind of forced, that interaction. But more you do it, easier it gets, and more it kind of becomes a way I'm actually making notes for myself. So your writing of that first post might be actually kind of you summarizing what you got out of it and what you still remember, and maybe identifying where I can help you, whether you have sticky points or something that we can clarify. And remember, it doesn't always have to be just me who answers the questions. So I encourage my students to help. If another student asks a question, don't hesitate to jump in and say that, hey, I actually know an answer to this. I'm going to share an answer. The second discussion post, I think I've seen some amazing examples recently on our forums of people sharing either their own personal or stories or experiences, either through their profession or family members, of various different conditions that relate to the topics that we're talking about. So again, that's that kind of application space. That's something that I would imagine that would happen in face-to-face class. So we just take it now into an online format. We also have 2 other assignments on chapter 11 and chapter 10, one on each. On chapter 11, we actually get to do a virtual simulation of a lab activity. And I think that it's a rather good simulation. You'll get to see how electrical impulses cause an skeletal muscle to respond. This would be a lab that you could see in person in some of the classrooms. But I think that doing it in a virtual setting gives you almost just as good of an experience, and maybe it's even a little bit more ethical, so we're not sacrificing frogs to do those measurements. We're rather doing it in a virtual setting and saving a couple of lives in the process. So I encourage you to work through that simulation. If I'm not mistaken, I think that there's no way of not getting full marks on that simulation as long as you work your way through all of it. it. I do realize that sometimes it's kind of, if you're not super familiar with the approach, how McGraw-Hill's Connect has formulated those virtual labs, you can kind of be stuck that what do I do next? But I do think that there's pretty clear steps on the simulation, and I encourage you to kind of utilize it as a chance to kind of expand on what we've learned in the chapter learning material. So that was the chapter 11 assignments. On chapter 10, we also have another food for thought mini essay. So you've been doing a few of those already. And this time we're looking at hamstring injuries. And I didn't have one for our last food for thought assignment, but I do have one for this one. And what I'm talking about is kind of pre-written, pre-prepared grading rubric. So you will actually see this rubric even before you participate into that discussion or participate into writing that essay. So I encourage my students to kind of use it as a kind of a guide to double check that you've covered everything you need to cover, so you can get those full marks on that activity as well. Obviously, if you feel that that's helpful, start by writing first yourself and then kind of at the end double checking that you've covered everything that I could potentially ask of that. So I just wanted to put that out there as kind of a hint. Other thing that I wanted to kind of address, and I already did speak about this and propose a couple of ideas on Wednesday. I do fully respect and agree with what few students have shared on the online forums, that learning all of the bones was a lot, and especially learning specific parts of different bones was a lot. And same goes for learning the major skeletal muscles in the body. There's a lot of ground to cover, and we all learn differently. We all have different approaches. I would probably encourage you to try to divide the amount of material into manageable chunks. Don't just sit down and think I'm going to stare at the textbook for the next 45 minutes and magically know every single muscle in the body after that. That might work for some, but for most of us, dividing it into that, hey, I'm going to focus now to the muscles of head and neck. Then I'm going to focus on the muscles of upper limb. I'm going to focus on the axial muscles. I'm going to focus on the muscles of the lower limb. Dividing it into kind of those sections might be more useful approach. And also, if you're struggling to learn the muscles, rather than learning each individual muscle, try to group them into groups and then learn what those groups do. And that allows you then to expand what you've learned to individual muscles. For example, flexors and extensors of upper limb or lower limb might be a good way of tackling it. Because people learn differently. One way to learn muscles is definitely by taking a handout where you have all of the key muscles drawn for you, kind of an outline of a body, and then color and label those muscles as you go through the material. And I do believe that I've offered at least some handouts there on your learning materials for this week. Other way to approach learning these muscles is to use virtual reality or virtual 3D models or 3D illustrations that you can access on your mobile devices. Many students find those useful. Your textbook provides great pictures. And if you're a very hands-on learner and you still feel like this isn't working out for me fully, one of the resources that we have for our face-to-face students is anatomical models of the muscles. We've got some that are smaller and some life-sized ones of particular body parts especially. So if you feel like actually interacting with those 3D models would be useful, we do have all of the muscle models. I've made them available for you at our learning center, or sometimes it gets called tutoring center. This summer, it's located only at the Pecos campus at the library on the 2nd floor, and it's open when the college is open throughout the summer. They do also have an online availability for tutoring. So I would encourage you to explore that if you feel that that would be helpful. Remember, at this college, your tutoring is included in your tuition. You do not need to pay extra for that. So that's kind of a nice resource available. Sometimes students are a little nervous going to those learning and tutoring centers because they're like, oh, am I going to be quizzed and really bugged into having a dialogue when I just want to learn? They actually have two approaches that you can just go there and just study at the models. You put kind of a little sign on a table that I'm good, I don't need additional help. I'm here just to focus on the models myself. Or you can put a sign that, hey, I would really like when a tutor is available for them to come and sit down with me and let's discuss about things that I might be struggling or things that might be where I could use a little bit of a help. Our tutors are individuals who have taken classes with your instructors in the past, so they often have very useful tips and hints to share with you as well, especially kind of how different instructors grade. I guess what you would hear about me is that I'm a big fan of personal experiences and big fan of personal relevance on the material. So if you can draw that out in any of the writing activities, you can count on getting extra credit. If the Pecos campus doesn't work for you for studying those models, I am pretty much every single day when college is open throughout the entire day available at Williams campus. I do have some meetings, I do have some other face-to-face teaching, but even if I'm in a meeting or even if I'm in an other class teaching it, I am happy to organize so that even during that time you have access to those models. So in that case, if that would be helpful for you, just send me a message. I prefer through Canvas messages and we'll figure it out together. We're here wanting to leverage any tools and any resources that we have so you can be successful. Other thing that I proposed last Wednesday was for students who feel that it'd be helpful. Similarly, as we saw last week, many students had found that those plastic skeletons from Halloween came in handy when you were learning different parts of the skeleton. Obviously, they're not always fully anatomically accurate, but most of the time you can kind of make them work for you, and you can then rectify what's not anatomically accurate. Similarly, I recommend that if you're a learner who's very hands-on and would benefit from it, consider getting one of the plastic skeletons. They're cheap online or from Hobby Lobby. You will definitely at least find clay, and then using clay to build the muscles on those. Well, I actually today, since I'm in another building, I was able to get an example of a model that my students would use in my normal classes, in face-to-face classes, where they literally build the muscles to the body as we go through those muscles of the body, and many of them find it incredibly helpful rather than staring at the diagram to kind of build up of the of actually what they're covering. The big idea on using those kind of resources is that it forces you to identify where the muscle starts and where it ends, and it helps you then to kind of pay attention to the shape of the muscle. And when you know the shape of the muscle, where it's located, then it becomes easier to understand what kind of movements it does as well. So that is one of the resources that you can independently pursue if that's helpful for you. If you run into dead ends and can't find plastic skeletons, can't find clay, which I don't think is a barrier for most people, but if you do run into that, let me know. I'll see what resources I can leverage on individual cases as well. But it has proven to be a very, very successful technique. You can see that my students use it not just for muscular system, but for example, studying blood vessels, because many of the blood vessels are much more three-dimensional than your textbooks lead you to believe. So you kind of gain that information through that approach as well. So I just wanted to put it out there in case that's helpful for anyone, that that's one approach to look at these courses. If you end up building those muscles out of the clay, or even if you just want to see someone else building those muscles out of the clay, I've actually recorded short videos of for my students of when I first started this approach of teaching, where I've not only that I do it in a classroom with the students, but if students miss the class, they can go and see what muscles we built and how we built them, kind of more of on a time-lapse basis. So those are available for you on the Canvas course as well. I've labeled them on this week's module as short videos, and they cover typically multiple muscles on a same area in very brief, about 30-second period, just kind of highlighting those key things. So again, that's something that might be helpful for some students, doesn't have to be helpful for every student, but I'm putting options out there. And I do realize that sometimes some students say that, well, that's very intimidating because there's so many videos to watch, but remember, they're very, very short videos and you only watch them if they're helpful for you. So we find ourselves back on this week's material. The final thing that we're doing this week that we haven't yet spoken about is that we're doing our second exam and our second practical. Again, I do have a discussion forum that goes with those, but because I want to keep the workload manageable for you, you only need to make one post on that exam to practical to discussion forum for getting full marks for it. I have found that many students have shared really useful hints and tips and tricks for other students after they've taken exams on that forum. So maybe if you're feeling hesitant, it might be worthwhile to look through that forum so you have an idea of what might be worthwhile to focus on. So just putting it out there. All of these assignments, I'm hoping that we get them in by the end of the week. So 1 minute before midnight is when they would be due. I would not leave the exam and practical to Sunday night at 11:50 to start. Just in case, even if you're amazing and you can get it done quickly, just in case you have technical issues, it would be a shame if you miss out on due date because of that. Having said that, I do realize that sometimes our computers act up and so on. If you run into issues, let me know through Canvas messages, and I will, on a case-by-case basis, troubleshoot that. So, because I know that students are always nervous about the exams and practicals, I was going to get that out of the way right away, and then we'll talk about rest of the chapter material. But I wonder if there's a question.
Hold on. Sorry, I'm making unnecessary comments because like obviously.
No, you're good. This is exactly what I did. Error.
I'm so sorry, I missed the first part of that. Well, I'm sorry I didn't hear the first part of that, but feel free to just say again or drop to the chat. Well, I can't hear if you're speaking. I heard a little bit of the kind of end on the background, but if there's anything that I can do to help, just, oh, okay, just probably accidentally. Yeah, I'm sorry, I had my speakers muted. I could just see on the screen that it was lighting up. But that's probably, if questions come up, feel free to just let me know. So let's start with having a look of the exam 2 and practical 2, what's going on with those. Kind of the word of encouragement that I would give for that is that remember, you only have 3 exams and 3 practicals on this course. So once you're done with this, you only have 1 more to go. So you're way past the midpoint. So in exam 2, we're covering 4 chapters. The chapter 8 on skeleton, chapter 9 on joints, Chapter 11, kind of the introduction to general muscle tissue, especially skeletal muscle. And then chapter 10, which was the muscles of the skeletal system, the major big muscles that we might want to know. This is a single setting exam. So once you start it, I ask you to finish it on the same go. There is a timer that starts going once you started. You have about 60 minutes, or not about, you have 60 minutes to complete that exam. There's 28 questions. That gives you more than 2 minutes per question, which is more than ample amount of time. I follow those also very carefully, that if I have any students who might have missed out on time or who are struggling, and I'm going to be honest, pretty much every single student of mine finishes the exam with plenty of time to spare. That time allows you to that most of the questions are very quick. They're either multiple choice or true false, where you will know within first 5 to 10 seconds the answer, or you'll know at least whether you know the answer. So that time allows you to look up a couple of the questions if you need to, but you probably won't have enough time to look up every single question from the material. So that kind of helps to frame how to approach it. I think most of my students end up finding that they have good notes and they have resources, which you are more than welcome to use in the exam. It's a non-proctored open book exam, but they find that most of the time they actually don't need those resources. So it's kind of like a backup resource, but most students don't even end up needing it. That exam is worth of 100 points, so it's worth of quite a bit of points. So I would really encourage getting that done just to kind of get those points that count the biggest. I have a sample question there on the screen for anyone who wants to kind of have an idea, and I believe that this is actually the actual first question in the exam. So in that sense, maybe useful to look through it. Here on this question, I'm asking you to choose the right options from the drop-down menu. So you're seeing bones, and you're being asked, where would you find that bone in the body? So we're seeing that frontal bone is part of the skull. Sternum would be part of the thoracic gauge. Scapula would be part of the pectoral girdle. Hip bone would be part of the pelvis. Ribs would be part of thoracic gauge. Clavicle, our collarbone, would be part of our pectoral girdle. Our maxilla would be part of the skull, sacrum would be part of the pelvis, and costal cartilage is part of the thoracic gauge. So that kind of gives you an idea of one type of a question. So I do have those drop-down menu questions, but like I said, most of the questions are going to be multiple choice, true, false. I do sometimes throw in some fill in the gap. So you type in the answer. There can be a variety of different questions, but most of the time it is very, very straightforward and very simple questions. So that hopefully sets you at peace of what to expect. In terms of how to best prepare for the exam, it's again I would strongly encourage you to make sure that you do those homework quizzes. My questions reflect largely the work that you've already done. So really doing that weekly homeworks is gonna prepare you to do well on those. And if you want to practice, go and revise, go and check those quizzes. You also get at the end of the quizzes the right answers. So that might be a good tip and good tool when you're thinking how to prepare for the exam. So that was the exam. For the practical 2, same chapters, chapter 8 skeleton, chapter 9 joints, chapter 11 muscle tissue, and chapter 10 muscles. There's 50 questions, so now we have a little bit more material than we had in our first practical, and you have 60 minutes to answer those. And all of these questions are really straightforward, that there is going to be a picture, and on that picture one structure is highlighted, typically with an arrow, and you choose what that structure is from the list of options below. So they're very, very straightforward. Again, you have 60 minutes to answer those questions. That gives about a minute per question and some time out beyond that. It is a single setting test, so once you start it, please try to finish it on one go. And it is also open book, non-proctored. So again, I wouldn't say that I would encourage you to look up every single question in the practical. I don't think you will have time for it, but answer to those practical questions. And if you have any that you need to double check, you totally can do so. So here we're seeing a good example question. We're being asked to identify the bone indicated by arrow. And because my screen looks a little different than yours, I don't see the arrow, but I believe it's pointing here on the other side. So that's going to be our frontal bone. So then you would just choose that from the answer options and you would be done. So that's straightforward. Again, I think that revising, practicing those practice anatomy quizzes from our weekly assignments is probably the best possible way to prepare for practical. So that's all I have in terms of the exam 2 and practical 2. Does anyone have any questions? Is anyone more concerned or more nervous? Is there anything I can do to set you at peace with it?
I will say that I already took both of the exams and they were literally so straightforward and very like just get to the point. Like if you know the content and you're familiar with it, it's going to be very easy. So if anyone is struggling or thinking that it's going to be hard, it's very easy and our professors set us up for success.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that it's always so reassuring for students to hear from their peers rather than me saying that, trust me, bro, it's going to be fine. It's helpful to hear from actually someone who's done that. So thank you again for sharing that. And I promise I'm here to see you be successful. I'm not here to catch you out. That's my teaching philosophy. So I'm glad that it's translating to that. So in that case, I think we're ready to move ahead. But again, if anyone has any questions at any stage, feel free to just jump in, unmute yourself, or drop it to the chat. So what I was going to do next was to go through kind of the highlights of the chapter content. I'm going to probably focus more heavily on chapter 11 and then give you kind of tools and tips for how to tackle the chapter 10. So one way to think about why we need to learn about skeletal muscles is, and muscular system in general, is that about half of the body mass is a result of your muscular system. So it is going to be something that we need to know about. And I think that the skeletal muscles follow really nicely what you have learned about skeletal system before, because we saw that, yes, bones were crucial for us, but really, if we didn't have those muscles and if we didn't have places where those muscles can connect, which is our bones, we wouldn't be able to create those movements. So muscles and muscular system itself is important, but it has to interact with that skeletal system. Really what I'm trying to highlight on this slide, I believe, is the concept that we're converting chemical energy, so ATP, into mechanical energy or mechanical movement with the muscular system, or rather than movement, it could be force that we're creating with the muscular system. So I guess that kind of captures why we spent some time at the beginning of the semester talking about the chemical basis of life. Here's kind of a brief outline what we'll be looking at. We'll look at types of muscles, muscle tissue characteristics, and also muscle functions. And some of the terms that you might see when we're talking about muscular system include terms that have prefixes myo, meso, or sacro. All of those kind of refer to muscles and muscular system. If we look at the etymology of these terms, I think we see some interesting stories from the early anatomists, early physiologists, who were kind of mistakenly thinking that maybe there's little mice in the muscles who cause then movements to take place. Well, we know that it's not a mouse, but we will get to look at the actual structure which creates that movement. So in that sense, they were not totally wrong, just what they assumed it to be, that was wrong. There is 3 types of muscle tissue in our body, and we talked about these at the beginning of the semester as well. We saw that we have skeletal muscle, which is really going to be our focus on BIO201 course. Skeletal muscle cells were characterized by this cylindrical appearance, multiple nuclei. Remember, typically one cell has one nucleus. We see, based on the fact that skeletal muscles have multiple nuclei, that they're actually a result of multiple cells fusing together during the development. We also see striation in skeletal muscles, and these striations are going to be something that we'll kind of unbundle in just a moment. That why do we see these stripes? in skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles are under voluntary control, so you get to choose when you create a movement and when you control these muscles, and they are really the large muscles of the body that we typically ask our students to learn. So that's what we're talking there. We won't be talking much more about cardiac muscle or smooth muscle, but I'll introduce them now. Both of those, I think, will be covered in greater extent in BIO202. So cardiac muscle cells are found only within the heart, and the purpose there was to make sure that every single heart muscle cell at the same site contracts at the same time. So in order to create this synchronized contraction in the heart, cardiac muscle cells were branched in their appearance. At the end of these branches, we also see something known as a structure known as an intercalated disc. Intercalated disc facilitates easy passage of materials and messages from one cell to another, so we can really create those uniform movements. Some of the characteristics of cardiac muscle cells is that they have central nucleus and they do have striation as well. So those stripes that we talked about. Cardiac muscle cells are under involuntary control, so you don't need to think about having a heartbeat. It happens automatically. The final muscle tissue type that we're going to see is going to be our smooth muscles. Our smooth muscles are not super exciting if you think of the single cell, but they look like they're just kind of blob spindle-shaped cells that have a central nucleus, no striations. Their shape can change drastically when they contract, however. Smooth muscle is also involuntary, so you don't need to kind of send messages intentionally to the smooth muscles so that they would do their job. It happens automatically on the background. We find smooth muscles within your intestines, so within your digestive system, whether it is creating sphincters there or regulating other processes. For example, passage of the material down the esophagus would be a good example of that. We see also smooth muscle around blood vessels controlling the diameter of the blood vessel. So that's another place where we see smooth muscles. So our focus, however, on this chapter is on the skeletal muscles. Another thing that I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about was the four main characteristics of a muscle. So muscles are the only body tissue with the following four properties. Muscle tissues are excitable or irritable, if you wish to use that word, so they respond to stimuli. That's what we're trying to say there. They respond to stimuli, you can excite them, you can irritate them, they respond to that. So a good example is that lab, the virtual lab that you'll be doing. When we give electrical stimulus to the muscle of a frog leg, it will then respond to that. Second characteristic that's worthwhile to notice is that muscle tissue is also contractile. So muscle shortens or contracts when stimulated. So that's, again, you see when you do that lab, that electrical impulse, electrical stimulation was enough to cause the frog leg then to respond to that, to shorten in response to that. Other thing that I wanted to highlight when we talk about the muscles being contractile, is the fact that do remember, however, that muscles are still working even if they are not lengthening or shortening. So if you took a heavy weight, let's say that you take a gallon or a couple of gallons heavy bottle of water or weight, and you hold it with a straight arm, your muscles will have to keep working just to maintain that weight upright. So I think that a lot of exercises in the field of Pilates capitalize on this, that you might not be doing as much as large movements as you would be doing when you're doing cardio at the gym, but you're actually getting a good workout simply from making those muscles work, even if they're not changing significantly in their length. The third characteristic that's unique or special to the muscle tissues is that they're extensible, so they can be stretched in response to a force. And again, this is something that I think that Pilates is a good example of how we utilize that in that setting. Final characteristic that I wanted to mention was the fact that muscles also have elasticity, so they recoil, so they return to their original, or if you wish to say resting length, once the force that stretches them has been removed. So these are, I guess, the important things to remember, what makes the muscle tissue special, or what are the unique characteristics for muscle tissues in our body. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, and I think that the picture is leading us to that discussion, is about working out and training and skeletal muscles in relation to that. And I did actually look up a quote from online that emphasize that instructing a patient in an exercise that does not follow the line of pull will be less effective and could potentially place additional stress on damaged tissues. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that the wrong technique, especially on weight training, can be a major issue. You can actually make the situation far worse by using weights when you're not using them correctly and you're not following through on those exercises. So a good personal trainer would probably emphasize the importance of a right technique. The other thing that I think a good personal trainer always emphasizes is the importance of building your core, so strengthening those core muscles. So once you have that in place, then you can do more, but you can't kind of skip on the technique. You can't skip on developing a strong core, because that will then come and cause issues later on. So I guess the question is that, well, what happens if I have a wrong technique, or what happens if I don't train the muscles in a right approach? Well, I do have a picture that's coming up on the screen. I don't think it's super gruesome, but I do want to give heads up for anyone who's squeamish. And what we're seeing here is an athlete, and I believe that this was in actually Olympic Games, but I might be wrong, of a runner who had been training muscles, but training muscles in a way that didn't follow the best practices that we have. So you'll end up noticing that many muscles, especially on upper and lower limbs, come in pairs. You have your flexors and you have your extensors. And when you're training them, you want to train the both on both sides. So we want to train both our extensors and flexors, because what happens if you train one muscle group and not the other muscle group, you can develop that it becomes so strong that it can contract with such a great force, and there's nothing opposing to that, that you can actually even snap your own bone as a result. This is, of course, for elite athletes. For us lay people, you're not going to snap your bones because your muscles are too strong in day-to-day activities. It is if you're trained and you really train to have strong muscles, but you don't do that in a balanced approach. So again, those overtraining only one set of muscles could be problematic. So I wanted to put that out. The next thing that I was going to talk about is really some of the functions of the muscular system. And obviously there's many functions, but I've highlighted 4 primary ones, and then we can kind of expand from that. The first and probably the most obvious function that most of my students think about is that muscles produce movement. So we use this, for example, for locomotion and manipulation of things like you walking, or even your digestive system relies on the movement created by muscles in that continuous track. Even I think that the movement, we can think of the heart creating movement of the blood by pumping that blood onwards in our cardiovascular system. The second thing that muscles do, they help us with our posture and body position, especially maintaining that body position. So even staying still is a lot of work and hard work. I normally would have my students in a class standing up and standing on one leg, and pretty soon they would notice that they're doing slight muscle adjustments all the time just to maintain their balance. So that's a really good example of that interaction of the skeletal muscles and the nervous system. Other thing that muscles do, they also stabilize our joints. So again, we're seeing the skeletal system and the muscular system working together. If we didn't have muscles, those joints wouldn't be serving their purpose. A lot of the time, it is the muscles that keep those joints so that they don't just give up to the direction of the gravity. So muscles playing an important role there as well. I think that your shoulder joint was particularly good example of that. Like we discussed last time, there's not that much really going on in terms of the bony fit. So it's all the muscles that are holding the joint there together. So we owe a lot of that to our rotator cuff muscles, for example, to stabilize our shoulder. The final of the 4 major functions that I wanted to highlight that I have here is the heat production. So this heat production can be a byproduct of as we're moving. Let's say that we're going to the gym and exercising there. So because you remember the laws of the physics, every time you converted or changed energy from one form to another, you lost some energy as a heat. So when we go to the gym and we run on a treadmill, we will probably have our body temperature rising. So that produces heat. And that's why we think it's sweating and we have blood carrying that temperature, internal temperature to the body surfaces and so on and so on. But this heat production can show up in another setting as well. I don't know, we're in Arizona, so especially Arizona summer, you don't think about this, but I think in the winter we still get some chilly times, so colder times. So if you're feeling cold, you'll notice that your muscles start to shiver. The purpose of shivering is actually to produce heat. We're not really doing productive movement that's going to help us to move somewhere. The purpose of shivering is that we convert that chemical energy into heat, and that helps us to remain warm in cold environments. Obviously, there's other functions that also additional functions that would go with the muscular system. We protect many organs, especially on abdominal cavity, since there isn't as much bony protection. We have muscles protecting those internal organs. We also see that, for example, your muscles can form sphincters that regulate movement within, for example, digestive tract, controlling the release of the urine from the urinary bladder to the external world, and so on and so on. We also can see that muscles play a role in a very small scale, for example, controlling your pupil size, or even, as we saw with the erector pili muscle in case of the goosebumps. So a bunch of roles that we end up seeing for the muscular system. So those were kind of, I guess, some of the general themes that I wanted to mention. Do you want to come up or are you staying down? Sorry, I have my cat who's all of a sudden deciding to be part of our class. You coming up? If you come up, you can't knock over things. So let's see what we're going to learn. So next thing that I wanted to talk about was regarding our skeletal muscles. So we see that on males, about 42% of your body mass would be skeletal muscles. On females, about 36% of your body mass. These are, of course, averages, and there's variability from one individual to another. I guess we see the difference between males and females in skeletal muscle percentage, largely due to driven by testosterone. That gives a greater ability to enlarge those muscle fibers. So remember, when you go to the gym and you work out, you don't actually magically create more muscle fibers. You just grow those muscle fibers that you have bigger. Now I think that how we're going to look at the skeletal muscle first is to consider it also as an organ. So we see that skeletal muscles are made of not only of the muscle, but they get the nervous supply to them. So a nervous system becomes important on controlling these. And we'll also see the cardiovascular system coming important. So arteries and veins that supply to the muscles oxygen and nutrients so that they can do their job. what I wanted to show here was really kind of zoom in to smaller and smaller structures of a muscle as we're kind of discussing this, moving from an organ to more of a histological level. So the first connective tissue layer that we end up seeing is kind of, and we'll see that this theme keeps repeating, that as we're moving smaller and smaller, these structures are packed in bundles that are enclosed in a connective tissue. So the first one of these is going to be our epimuseum, which is really kind of the most external one and surrounds the entire muscle itself. When you cook meat products or meat foods, for example, it might be that we have to remove this connective tissue layer from around of the meat that we're cooking because it's not very pleasant in terms of consuming it as part of your diet. Then we move on to smaller structures that form the contents of the epimuseum inside there. And we'll see that those smaller structures are wrapped in a perimuseum, which is really what surrounds a group of muscle fibers. And these muscle fibers are what we know as fascicles. And then if we zoom inside this, that is exactly, there was a good point shared in the chat. The silver skin that gets removed from muscles. If you buy a big chunk of meat, you have to remove, we recommend that you remove that. And that is what your epimuseum would be, what you would be seeing there. So that's a really good analog. One hint that I gave, and I know not everyone has a chance, but I had a luxury when I was an anatomy student myself, that I figured, where would I get good practice as a student? And I went to work for butchers, because you really learn a lot about muscular system if you work for meat processing business. It's not necessarily the most fun job always, but that's where I started my training to become very good at dissection. The perimuseum was surrounding those fascicles, packing them in bundles, and then we see inside those, we see individual muscle fibers that are wrapped in endomuseum. This is the kind of final level, if you wish, of zooming in. So I guess what I wanted to show with this picture was really that we can go from a larger organ to the level of microscopic study, because that's exactly what we're doing in the next couple of chapters. There was something else that I also wanted to talk about, and I wanted to talk about the fact that a lot of textbooks will emphasize that when you're learning muscles, you should learn about the origins and insertions of the muscle. So when we're talking about an origin of a muscle, this is usually the proximal attachment to an immovable or is less movable part of the body. And then the insertion is usually the distal attachment point to the movable bone. Many textbooks are really passionate about students learning for each muscle, their origins and insertions. I kind of say to my students as an anatomist, that I just care that you know where the muscle connects. You don't necessarily need to draw a difference whether the connection point is insertion or origin. I guess the big thing that we learn from these, however, is that muscles work as levelers or work on the levelers to produce movement. And when I say that muscles work on levelers to produce movement, I'm obviously talking about the bones. So let's see an example of that here. So here we have a man lifting a stone with a leveler. So they're using a stick or steel bar. And what's important is that we can amplify the force created by the source of the force, in this case, this whole man, but it could be an individual muscle. And we can amplify that force by choosing where the pivot point is in relation to the leveler, in relation to the load, and in relation to where the effort is taking place. So by putting that pivot point very close to the load, that man doesn't have to push as hard to move the rock. And we actually see this, and I think we have a couple of students in this course who are kind of more on the engineering side of the house, and we see this, that many muscles utilize it incredibly smartly. So for example, on our lower joint, lower limb, we see that patella actually brings the connective tissue connecting that muscle and parts of the muscle outward. So we're kind of creating that leveler moment arm to get a stronger of force than what the muscle could create by itself, by being strategic where the muscle is and where the load that we're trying to move with it is located. So really, the big thing that we're noticing is that how far apart the origin and insertion are is what gives the mechanical advantage. And this actually is a field of sciences, if you're interested, called articulation biomechanics, which combines both physiology and engineering. And there's not too much out there on that field yet. So if you're looking for a field that's new and emerging and you want to get involved, that would be one that I kind of would encourage you to look into if this feels like your interest. So what I next wanted to do was to talk a little bit about the microanatomy and also about the sliding filament model of the muscular system and skeletal muscular system. So what we saw earlier on were these skeletal muscle fibers, which were really kind of long and cylindrical cells that contained multiple nuclei, and we saw these stripes. Well, now if we zoom in inside of a single cell, we will actually be able to study that there are sacrolemma, which are really the kind of surrounds the plasma, kind of the plasma membrane of the cell, if you wish, in this setting. And we have there something known as myofibrils. These myofibrils are kind of, there's multiple of those, they're kind of rod-like elements, and they form about 80% of the muscle's volume. So kind of interesting structures in that sense. What we're going to do next, we're going to look at an individual myofibril in a greater detail. So let's do just that. So each myofibril contains our sarcomeres. So sarcomere is single, kind of like, I think of a blob in between one Z disc and another Z disc. So if you wish to divide these into kind of parts, sarcomere would be one individual part located between these Z disc structures. And now this brings us to another important topic to talk about, which is those striations that we saw in skeletal muscle. You remember that I mentioned that both skeletal muscles and in fact also cardiac muscle had these stripes. And if we look at this microscopic structure, we can start to figure out why we see those stripes. We have areas where we have actin, which is kind of a thin filament. In this picture, it's that bluish one. Light passes through it relatively easily. And then we have myosin, which is a thicker filament, which is red on this picture, and light has harder time passing through it. So because these kind of take turns, that's what drives us to see these stripes on both skeletal muscles and cardiac muscles. So it is really those dark bands that were our H zones and light bands that were our Z disc, which result on those stripes that you were able to see with a microscope. So you might ask that why is this sarcomere so important? Why do we need to talk about that? And that is really the smallest contractile unit of a muscle fiber. So that's the functional unit of a muscle. So let's zoom in to this and make this a little bit complicated. So within a sarcomere, and here you have an electron microscopy image of one. I just always like to show real images because students sometimes think that I make up these things to torture them. Within a sarcomere, we can see our myofilaments. And within myofilaments, we see actin and myosin. So actin was this kind of a thinner filament in this figure, the blue one. And then the myosin was thicker filament in this picture, the red one. And these actually, when muscle works, slide past each other and away from each other. And that's how we can alter the length of the muscle itself. So when muscle contracts, as you see in this second picture, this is the initial stage on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you see a contracted muscle. You'll notice that the muscle shortens, and how it shortens is that these filaments slide past each other and form more overlap. So their length doesn't really change. They just overlap each other. And when muscle extends, they slide again past each other so that they can provide more length to the muscle. So really these parts don't change themselves, their relation to each other changes. And you will be able to see on these myosin filaments little foot-like structures that literally walk on the actin filaments. So we're seeing that movement created there. And this is what has given rise to an explanation that we just went through that's called sliding filament model of muscle action. So I think that this is a very, very useful theme to be aware of. I realize that most students who sign up to study anatomy or even physiology think of the big picture things, but understanding the muscle on a small level allows us then to unbundle those big movements that we'll be talking about. A couple of other things in chapter 11 that I wanted to mention. What we see is that the nerve impulse is traveling down the nerve cell to the end of a nerve cell, which is known as an axon terminal, and their chemicals are being released at the synapses, and it's especially acetylcholine, that chemical that we see most often, that then causes a change in the flow of calcium, and that then alters the muscle and muscle function. You might wonder, why does this calcium matter? Well, calcium, we kind of end up seeing that in most chemical reactions, most physiological reactions when we study it on a chemical level of the body. So calcium is pretty much everywhere an important contributor to these reactions. And one example of calcium's role in muscle activity is what we see when we talk about rigor mortis. And I initially had a picture, but I felt kind of bad putting it out there, so I didn't put it on this. But I know that Jason wrote a good answer on our discussions about this. But what rigor mortis is the stiffening of the muscles, starting kind of a couple of hours after the death has started or that has taken place. And it can take anywhere from 4 to 4 days in its duration, after which then rigor mortis fades away. And we use this in forensic settings to determine how long the body that we're working with has been dead. And in fact, we're able to kind of, if we know the environmental conditions, how cold, how warm it was, things like that, we're able to be pretty precise on estimating the time of death for that body. So what we see really is that in rigor mortis, the chemicals and the calcium, in fact, causes the muscle mass to become very rigid. So rigor mortis as a term is from Latin and means rigid death. So what happens here is that the myosin heads stay bound to actin and in this kind of constant state of contraction. So it really looks like body would be frozen in time and place. What's interesting, again, like I said, that we can time the time of death with rigor mortis, is that rigor mortis doesn't set throughout the body all at once. It starts from the small muscles and typically moves from head to toe direction. So again, where do we see rigor mortis? Where has it already passed away? Is going to be crucial for us. So I think that brings us to everything I wanted to say about chapter 11. And that moves us to chapter 10. So you'll see that I kind of mixed up the order of chapters with the intention of first going through the small stuff so we can appreciate the big stuff. And in terms of the chapter 10, I guess one way to frame it is that there's over 600 muscles in the body. And I'm certainly not going to make you learn all of them. The best way to learn them is grouping them, either grouping them based on function or grouping them based on location, or sometimes both. I think that the best way, again, for me at least, is to look at individual muscles on a bigger diagram. But then as I'm learning those and labeling those and maybe coloring that diagram, I can appreciate the nearby muscles as well. So that's something to keep in mind. You learn a lot about muscles based on their name. It tells a lot of important information. Also identifying where that muscle would be located or identifying it on pictures that you have. I also encourage you to kind of think of the function of the muscle. What kind of movements does a contraction of a particular muscle allow you to do in the body? And one of the things that many of my students have shared with me that they find useful is acting out these functions as you're studying them. So you can actually feel the muscle contracting if you're well positioned. So some of the kind of hints or tips for you as you're tackling those. Like I said, I go through the individual muscles on my lecture videos. I think I start with the facial muscles, and then head and neck, and so on and so on. What's really important when you're learning those is that you find what's beneficial for you, how you learn the best, and that you kind of, I would encourage you to be mindful of making it into a manageable amount of work all at once. Another thing to notice is that muscles come in very much of a three-dimensional setting. So these diagrams that we often give to you kind of mislead you, thinking that all of the muscles would be flat on one plane. There's more superficial, and then there's more deeper muscles. So you'll see often these muscles highlight on different sides, different depth of the body as well. That might be useful as you're learning those. So a couple of tips to learning muscles. Again, learn the muscle's name, identify the muscle itself, separate the muscle from others, think of the location, think of the attachments, think of the function, and again, acting those out can be helpful for many students. What I was going to focus next was on the muscle name and how much information that can give us. So the name of a muscle, rather than considering it as being mean and making you memorize something, consider spending the time with the muscle's name as a clue to make your life easier. So the name often reveals some or all of the following information. It can tell you about the location. So this is where having learned all those bones will pay off. So we'll see, for example, an example that I have there is our temporalis muscle, which is going to be resting over the temporal bone. So learning that paid off there. Or another thing that muscle name can tell you, it can tell you about the shape of that muscle. So a good example of that would be our deltoid muscle that I don't have here, but that's kind of a triangular in shape. Comes from the Greek word for deltoides, referring to triangle shape. So that can be a clue on the name as well. We also see that often names of the muscles might refer, if there's multiple similar muscles on the same area, it might refer to the size of the muscle as well. So we do have gluteus maximus, which is the largest muscle of the buttocks, but we also have gluteus minimus, or we can see some muscles that we describe that they are, for example, flexor longus pollicus or extensor longus pollicus. So it tells that it's a long muscle. So really paying attention to that might be helpful. We also see that the names of the muscle often tell you about the fiber direction of that muscle, so how the fibers run in that muscle, those stripes. So a good example would be rectus, means that the muscle fibers run straight, like rectus abdominis. We also have your transverse muscles, transverse abs. Transversus refers that they run in a transverse angle. Obliques run in kind of this weird angle. So you can again train your obliques when you're going to the gym, and that tells you the fiber direction, which was kind of this not aligning with major planes of the body. The name of the muscle can also give you a clue about the number of origins and insertions, how many endings we see. I think good examples would be our biceps, so 2, or triceps, 3. In terms of the numbers of the ends to keep on eye. We also will see on muscle names that we can see the number of attachment, or we can see the names of the attachment points, the locations where they connect. So whether that's origin or insertion or otherwise. One of my probably favorite examples, which I don't think I have on this model, so I'll use my own neck as an example, is our sternocleidomastoid muscle, which is this triangular muscle of the neck, actually has two bellies. And the name sterno refers that it connects to our sternum. Then it connects to the mastoid process of your skull. And it connects also to the clavicle. So that's the cleido. So sternocleidomastoid, we're seeing those three connection points of the triangular muscle of the neck. Other things that we can see is also on the muscle names, that muscles are named sometimes based on the action that they produce. So they can either be flexors or they can be extensors. So that tells us, remember, flexor reduce the angle between the two parts, extensor increase that. Oftentimes what we see is that one name or one muscle contains multiple of these. So the example that I've highlighted here is our extensor carpi radialis longus muscle, which tells us that it extends a body part, it passes through the wrist, follows along the radius, and it is long. So simply by taking a couple of moments to pay attention to the name, we're getting all of this wonderful information about that muscle. I was also going to talk a little bit about that fiber direction and some of the most common patterns that we see on those. So the circular arrangement is kind of a ring-like arrangement. A good place where we see that I've highlighted on this example would be our orbicularis oris, so the muscle bands around the mouth. Similarly, you'll see orbicularis oculi, as you see on this model, around the eye. We can also see muscle fibers that are described as being convergent. Convergent muscles fiber arrangement, we have a broad origin that then kind of converges into one. And a good example of that would be our pec major muscle that shows really that kind of a broad origin coming to one end. Other arrangements, fusiform muscles, we have this kind of a spindle-shaped appearance where we have parallel muscle fibers that fuse into one at both ends or two at the both ends. Biceps brachii was the one that I highlighted here as an example. We can also have muscles where we have the muscle fibers running parallel in relation to each other. So sartorius is one of the muscles that I've highlighted. It's actually the longest muscle in the body. So that's an interesting muscle there. Or we can have muscle fiber arrangement that's known as a pinnate, where the fibers attached to a central tendon. I think the deltoid is one of the examples of there. But remember, the number of those can then vary, whether they're unipinnate, bipinnate, multipinnate, based on how many of those muscle bodies bundles attached to that central tendon. So that brings me to the end of what I had planned to cover on this. I do realize that it's a lot of information. I hope that that at least gave you some pointers in terms of what to cover and how to approach it. Remember, everyone learns differently. Part of the process is that you find what's your learning style, but really try to collect those points, try to stay up to date on the assignments. It's going to pay off later on. And I think that I've gotten everyone's names recorded so that I can make sure that you're getting that extra credit for having been here. And again, I so appreciate that you're part of this class. I know summer is really intense, and that's something that you can definitely add to your resume afterwards, that you've shown excellent time management strategies, you've shown excellent ability to take in large amount of content in a short period of time by taking this accelerated course. So that's all I had planned for today. I'm going to stick around. I'm happy to answer any questions, happy to help with anything at all. But if there's anything, I'm around. But if you are done, there's nothing you need from me. That's it for today. And again, thank you for all your great work. Yeah, I would definitely add it to my resume that you did summer courses. It's as intense as it will ever get. You have a great day as well. Thank you. Yeah, I write a lot of references for my students, and those would be the things that I would emphasize about my students, how they're excellent at taking in large contents, a large amount of content, and managing their time and managing their learning. Well, since I don't hear any other questions, I'm going to wrap it up here today. And I hope you have a very good weekend. I hope you get to have a chance to have a breather as well. It is a lot, but we're starting to see the finish line ahead.